Okay, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about anxiety, and especially anxiety in Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky. First of all, we're all familiar with being nervous, particularly being nervous with each other. What we sometimes call social anxiety, and also the kind of anxiety that we experience when we don't really know why we're anxious, or we don't know what we're anxious about. We just know we feel nervous or stressed out, worried, fretful. There are really three layers of anxiety that Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, and later Heidegger, are concerned about and seem to be operating with a lot of the same ideas with respect to anxiety. We're going to be using the terms anxiety and dread interchangeably. They're not exactly the same in Kierkegaard, but for our purposes in existentialism, we're going to be treating them as the same. So the first level of anxiety is the anxiety that we associate with the world making demand upon us. The anxiety that we associate with the fact that things change and they're not necessarily in our control, or the fact that we are aware that things change and we have some responsibility for the way in which they change. The anxiety of making decisions, or feeling like we ought to be making decisions, feeling like we ought to be doing something that we're not necessarily doing. The second level of anxiety is the anxiety that comes from the recognition that other people are out there and they are somehow importantly similar to us. They have the same worries, the same concerns, the same needs, the same wants, but we aren't able to fully comprehend what it is they're after. We suspect that they want something from us, but we don't know exactly what it is. And we're worried about letting them down. We're worried about the way that they may be judging us or thinking about us. And we're worried about the way that they may be suffering, that they may need us, and yet we are incapable of helping them appropriately. The third level of anxiety is the kind of anxiety that is associated with our awareness of death, our awareness of a spiritual level of existence, whether it is God or the possibility of God, faith or the possibility of faith. The acute consciousness of freedom, that is the awareness that in some sense we are making our own world through our choices as we go, that the whole responsibility for our lives is entirely on our own shoulders, that when we die, whatever this life is will be over, and we don't know when we're going to die, we don't know how we're going to die, we don't know whether we're even going to, when we go to bed at night, if we will wake up in the morning. The great Kadampas of old used to turn their bowls over at night. The symbol in some cultures of a person being dead is to have their bowl turned over, their tea bowl or their eating bowl. But they would do it because they thought to themselves, I don't know if I will need this bowl tomorrow. I don't know if I will wake up in the morning. Because they were trying to constantly remind themselves of the unpredictability of death, of the kind of fundamental uncertainty of life, of the ephemerality of life. Okay, so 3 levels of anxiety. Now, for Dostoevsky, as for Kierkegaard, and as we will also see for Heidegger, anxiety isn't a bad thing. Every time that you're nervous, that's actually a good thing. You're nervous because you are being reminded of yourself, of what it is to be you, of how you think about yourself, of the kinds of self-construction you're involved in, of the fact of self-awareness, of your consciousness of being you in the universe, and ultimately your sort of responsibility for yourself in the universe. So one little lesson we can usefully take away from Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Heidegger on anxiety is that we shouldn't fight being nervous. We shouldn't be upset with ourselves about being nervous. We should, if we can, liberate ourselves from the claustrophobia of nervousness, of anxiety, of feeling like we have to somehow resist anxiety rather than accepting anxiety. Just one happy little lesson. Anxiety, according to Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Heidegger, is an opportunity. The opportunity is to not just necessarily think about why we are anxious. That's kind of the first stage of the opportunity. But an opportunity to realize that we are here. We are here right now in this moment. And that being here right now in this moment is all that we ever are. That's as far as we ever get. We never get out of this particular moment. And anxiety for all three of them is the taste of being in that particular moment. It's not the only taste, but it's very different than the taste of distraction, the taste of, in a way, different than the taste of boredom, although actually boredom can be a good opportunity for kind of transitioning into anxiety. Boredom isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. But even different than, fundamentally different than the kind of flavor of lethargy, the flavor of laziness, of sleepiness. Nervousness or anxiety is the feeling of being awake, of recognizing that there is this window of opportunity. Ultimately, for both Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, this is going to be a little bit differently true for Heidegger. For Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, the feeling of being anxious is our opportunity to see ourselves as larger than any particular individual. So when you are anxious, let's say, about something you feel like you have to do, the opportunity to recognize that in the larger scope of your experience, maybe there isn't anything so desperately urgent that you have to do. You can take a step back from all of your doing, all of your activity, and take that moment to think about, why am I doing the things that I am? Why do I feel these compulsions? What is it that's motivating me to move from the thought to the action? Do I have to act now? Or can I kind of take a deep breath and look at the various actions that I could be taking? For Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Heidegger, when we're thinking about freedom, what we want to think about, what we want to do, is not just to recognize the terrible weight that comes with freedom, the weight of creating our own universes, but also the fact that to make choices is to take the time to reflect, to sort through one's thoughts, to consider the gap between thinking and believing and acting. To recognize that you don't have to always be acting. You don't always have to be doing something. Merely existing, just existing and nothing more. A lot of the times that might be the whole of your job. Now, when it comes to the second layer we were talking about, the anxiety of being with others, here the sort of one criterion of value is not so much the criterion of activity as the criterion of understanding. In what way, if at all, are we actually understanding people, or are we just reflecting them back onto ourselves? Reflecting ourselves onto them, imposing notions onto them, rather than trying to experience them as beings like we are. Talking at them rather than talking to them. Merely hearing them rather than listening to them. Judging them. And, even worse maybe, feeling ourselves erroneously to be judged by them. So the anxiety is the opportunity to recognize that you're engaged in this kind of activity. You spend so much time going through the world thinking nice things about other people, and at the same time thinking that they're thinking unkind things about you. But you recognize how absurd how ridiculous that is. They're spending not all that much time thinking unkind things about you. It's a rarity, just as you thinking unkind things about them probably is a rarity. And the problem is not so much that you've misjudged everyone and are misjudging yourselves, although that could be part of the problem. The problem is rather that you're not opening yourself, which you can do through the consciousness of anxiety, to actual listening to them, which will also involve some actual listening to yourself. Then the third category of anxiety, dread, which can ultimately culminate in despair. Real old-fashioned despair with which most of us are all too familiar. There you have now the possibility for Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky of real religious experience. Well, for the experience of faith for Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, for Heidegger, for real spiritual experience, for a kind of reconciliation with existence. And we'll talk about this category some more, but one thing I'd like you to think about is kind of like I was speaking about anxiety generally, rather than running away from that, from allowing yourself to be in that, to not fight it, and then to see what happens as you're in this activity of not fighting despair. To see what it does to the way you think, to see what it does to the way that you pay attention, to see what it does to your belief structures. And in those moments, it might be that you just want to breathe and look. And above all, I think, don't act. When Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and Heidegger are all talking about immanence and this notion of being in the moment, the reason that they associate this with profound anxiety, with despair, is that it is difficult really to do anything other than be in the moment when you're experiencing profound anxiety. It might paralyze action, and normally, again, we think that's a bad thing, something we have to run away from, too painful. The challenge about anxiety and the opportunity is not to run away from it. Okay, we'll talk about these things some more. Thank you for watching this short introduction to anxiety.